Now, while there's reason to be very optimistic about the future of Aboriginal policing in rural areas because it has been transformed and will continue to evolve, I think, in a very positive way, there's less cause for optimism when we turn to our cities where there's no geographic community and no organized Aboriginal governance structure equivalent to band councils. Some people have suggested establishing separate urban Aboriginal police forces, but there are a lot of reasons why this is probably not feasible, although maybe somebody will invent a way of doing it. So the challenge that we face now is to find ways of ensuring that Aboriginal people living in urban areas receive policing that's fair, that's professional, and importantly, that's sensitive to their culture. And while I mentioned there really are no good models available, if we start to think of where we might go in the future in transforming it, I think there's at least three main issues that have to be addressed, or three main dimensions of solutions. One of them is that urban forces have to work at developing much stronger relationships with the Aboriginal community. The many commissions and inquiries that have addressed Aboriginal justice issues have all recognized that there need to be changes in the relationships between the police and those being policed. And that's not surprising, since most of the investigations arose from situations where the relationships were particularly bad. And we saw some of that in the film last night for those that were here. Commonly recommended measures, which appear in all of the Commission reports, liaison officers, advisory committees. These are a good idea, but unless they have some actual influence on decision making, they're not going to accomplish much. And given the backgrounds of people at this conference, I think many of us have had experience being on advisory committees, but nobody listens to our advice, so we eagerly leave those committees as soon as possible because it's not a good use of our time. I can't present any exemplary models of getting Aboriginal members of the urban communities involved in policing. In small communities with their own police forces, the band councils obviously can play a major role in determining how the police operate, but again, that's not easily translatable to urban communities. Some of the commissions and inquiries saw potential in the implementation of community policing, but unfortunately that potential hasn't been realized because most police departments haven't done anything very meaningful to allow significant community input into the way they do business. In fact, with the best of intentions, most police departments in Canada, when they set up community policing, did things like set up community offices and put officers in them, and the officers sat and waited for something to happen. I just did an evaluation of the neighborhood station program in Ottawa, which showed that these stations did nothing, and subsequently a number of them have been closed down. So if police forces are serious about improving relationships with Aboriginal people, they're going to have to find them a way to give them a meaningful role in their own policing. It's not likely we're going to find a template solution, so I can't draw you a diagram of what it's going to look like. And in fact, the methods are going to have to be developed locally to fit the local circumstances. Probably have to start with senior politicians and police meeting with representatives of Aboriginal communities and continuing the work that most of them have now started. And again, we saw some of that in the film last night on issues of concern. Ideally, other levels of government will get involved because there will likely be resource implications and perhaps some legislative changes. Perhaps this would fit or could be linked up with the federal government's urban Aboriginal strategy. The second dimension of better urban policing would be some effective methods of ensuring ethical and culturally sensitive policing. Historically, relationships between Aboriginal people and the police have been quite rocky, although this is variable depending on time and place. In a really good paper written for the Aboriginal Policing Directorate by Les Samuelson, who some of you probably taken classes from at U of S, he pointed out the role of police as agents of colonialism and their role as enforcers of laws that have been imposed on Aboriginal people. These historical issues, combined with the fact that in some parts of the country Aboriginal people have relatively high rates of involvement with the police, mean that the police have been and will continue to be regarded with suspicion and perhaps hostility by some Aboriginal people. How can that be improved? Well, common measures from the police point of view have been things like cultural training, sensitivity training, hiring more Aboriginal officers. These are all vital steps. They have to be done, but they're not going to have very much impact unless some other changes are made. We also need better and more training in ethical decision making. We need clear identification by police management of prohibited behaviors. And we need, most importantly, very active supervisory oversight To declare that there's a policy and to think that it's going to get done is not a real way of looking at any bureaucracy, and particularly at police departments. And this has to be done at all levels. As the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry said 15 years ago, the strongest method of combating racism is through a clear and unequivocal policy of dealing with those whose conduct implies overtly or covertly racist approaches to their duties. Now, I sympathize with police chiefs because it can be very difficult to change police organizations. One article I read about it used the term bending granite to bringing about significant change in police forces. The chief can probably relate to that. So it all has to be something that's very actively and continually addressed. This has to be something that's part of everybody's day-to-day job of constantly monitoring this, constantly leading by example, and by the example of not tolerating any abuses. Finally, the third dimension of more effective urban policing would be to improve oversight of police forces. And one of the other speakers would be dealing with that, so I just want to conclude by pointing out the importance of increased or enhanced accountability. Community surveys in Canada have shown that Aboriginal people were much less satisfied with the police than other Canadians, and they also reported a higher proportion of negative experiences with the police. And again, we heard last night in the panel the number of complaints that have gone into the FSIN hotline of complaints. Testimony before a wide variety of commissions, from our AGI in Manitoba to the recent Saskatchewan Justice Reform Commission, have reinforced the need for more effective ways of reporting and investigating complaints made against the police by Aboriginal people and by everybody else for that matter. Dozens of inquiries into police misconduct in Canada should long ago have taught about the need for independent review. But the police in many areas have fiercely guarded their right to investigate themselves and treat any attempt to require outside investigation as anti-police. And the most notable example of this is in Ontario, where successive chiefs of police in Toronto, and particularly their very militant Toronto Police Union, and if you like the documentary you saw last night, you should pick up one that the CBC put out called The Bully, which is about Craig Bromell, a leader of that union, who effectively wanted to turn Toronto into a police state. It's very bizarre. Anyway, these people have very aggressively opposed investigations by the province's Special Investigations Unit, which is an independent civilian agency that comes in to investigate police misconduct. And I just find this astonishing, because in many of the events that have led to inquiries into police misconduct, such as the AJI in Manitoba, the focus has been as much on botched investigations and on cover-ups as it has of the original incident. Most of the cases in which excessive force, particularly lethal force, is used are very ambiguous. So when a police department conducts an investigation and then announces that its members have done no wrong, those who are suspicious of the police for other reasons are not going to be convinced. There's a tremendous advantage to the police themselves to having independent inquiry and to involving community members who may feel that the police have acted in a racially motivated manner. Let me just finish by showing you two recent cases that happened within a week of each other in two Canadian communities to contrast different ways of handling these problems. Just after Christmas, two Vancouver police officers fired 15 shots at a man from the Niska First Nation who attacked them with a knife. The man was killed, and the Vancouver City Police Major Crimes Unit and their Internal Affairs Unit are conducting an investigation. And again, reminiscent of last night's film, local residents have already had a protest march down at the police station on Main Street in Vancouver. The second case took place on the Norway House First Nation in Manitoba and also involved a fatal shooting, but the RCMP in Manitoba took a very different approach. The RCMP immediately asked the Regina Police Service to oversee the investigation, and that involves sending a homicide investigator who is a First Nations background. A Crown Attorney from another province will assess the evidence. Perhaps the most interesting part of this case is that the RCMP invited an elder, who was also a band councillor, advised by the Assembly of Manitoba Chief's lawyer, to observe the entire investigation from start to finish. The RCMP Public Complaints Commission will also investigate. Now, the band chief attended the press conference announcing these arrangements and expressed strong support for the RCMP's actions. Now, it's obvious to me which of these two investigations is most likely to be accepted by the community. So there should be a lesson there. Thanks.